One of the reasons we felt compelled to research and write about this issue was that we observed a very biased and Islamophobic response to what occurred in Leicester last year. In the aftermath of the tensions in the city, there were a number of voices and organizations, both political and civil society, who framed the tensions as an quote Islamist-led event where the perpetrators were primarily Muslim and the victims were Hindus. And not only was this inaccurate, but it also played into long-held anti-Muslim stereotypes and tropes present in British society. The impact of this dangerous and racist logic has long been felt by British Muslims, as they remain the target of hate crimes as well as discriminatory government policies that view the community as a collective problem. With that being said, we analyzed how Hindu nationalism plays a role in perpetuating Islamophobia in Britain. And Leicester served as a case study in not only illustrating how there is a presence of Hindu nationalist sentiment in the UK, but also how individuals who either subscribe to Hindu nationalist beliefs or who hold anti-Muslim beliefs used the events to spread Islamophobia and create further divisions amongst the multicultural population of the city. The report is very comprehensive and we provide an overview of Hindutva or Hindu nationalism. We use those terms interchangeably. Hindu nationalism is a modern political ideology that believes in the hegemony of Hinduism in India, and it ties Hinduness to the identity of the nation. Proponents of Hindu nationalism seek to establish India as a Hindu-only nation, and today it is the official platform of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his ruling right-wing BJP. Under Modi's government, Hindu nationalism has become assertive, militant, and increasingly violent. This has included a drastic rise in hate speech, open calls for violence against minorities, primarily Indian Muslims, discriminatory legislation rendering Muslims second-class citizens, and a number of government actions such as the renaming of towns, erasing Islamic history in the education curriculum, and raising of mosques to kind of reconstruct India into a Hindu-only nation. As Sharmen said, it's important to stress that Hindu nationalism is not Hinduism. As I said, Hindutva is a modern political ideology. And in stark contrast to this exclusionary viewpoint, Hinduism is a religion. It's characterized by an overlapping set of practices, cultural values, and norms. It is one of the world's oldest religions today and has over 1 billion adherents, with the vast majority residing in India. The early ideologues of Hindu nationalism were actually inspired by 20th century European fascist movements, namely Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy. Vinayak Damodar Savarkar is considered to be the architect of modern Hindutva, and in his 1923 book that he wrote, which is considered the foundationalist text of Hindu nationalism, he notes himself that there's a difference between Hindu nationalism and Hinduism, and he argued that Indian Muslims and Christians could not be considered loyal patriots as India is not their, quote, holy land, and thus their love would always be divided as they would place their, quote, holy land above the, quote, fatherland. Today, Hindu nationalism is propagated by the RSS, which is a far-right paramilitary organization. The RSS is the leader of the Sangh Parivar, which is the family of the Sangh, an umbrella organization composed of a number of chapters and offshoots, all functioning under the broader ethos of establishing a Hindu Rashtra. And the Sangh's website states that the RSS sphere of influence has been spreading far and wide, not only in India, but also abroad. The Sangh has established itself in a number of countries, including the US, Canada, and the UK. So our report also looked at how the Islamophobia industry has involved itself with Hindu nationalism. And this has primarily been done by advancing Islamophobic tropes and smearing individuals, especially Muslims, who bring attention to the dangers of Hindu nationalism. For example, the very promotion for this event on social media was met with a barrage of derogatory, racist, and Islamophobic comments. And what do we mean when we say Islamophobia industry? It's a term used to describe an unorganized, loose network of individuals, donors, and organizations that manufacture disinformation and promote the hatred of Islam and Muslims. In the UK, there are a number of individuals who have expressed anti-Muslim views who have aligned themselves with proponents of Hindu nationalism. One example is Member of Parliament Bob Blackman. He has a consistent and documented record of expressing anti-Muslim views, including holding membership to Islamophobic Facebook groups, sharing anti-Muslim comments on his social media platforms, and retweeting anti-Muslim voices such as Tommy Robinson. For example, in 2017, in his role as chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Hindus, Blackman hosted an event organized by the National Council of Hindu Temples and Parliament for Tapan Ghosh, who's a hardline Hindu nationalist. Ghosh has publicly praised the genocide of Rohingya Muslims, claimed that all Muslims are, quote, jihadis, and advocated for forced birth control of Muslims. In September 2022, when the Leicester riots happened, Blackman wrote to the UK Home Secretary alleging that, quote, Islamist extremists were to blame for the violence between Muslims and Hindus. And this one-sided allegation was in stark contrast to the actual mainstream media reporting and interviews from individuals on the ground. Blackman's also connected with other prominent anti-Muslim voices in the country, namely the Henry Jackson Society. Reports published by the group have often framed Muslims as predisposed to violence or extremism and have given policy recommendations that support the securitization of the community. And in November of last year, Henry Jackson Society published a report written by Charlotte Littlewood on the events that occurred in Leicester, which basically cast blame on Muslim voices for the riots and tensions in the city. However, a June 2023 documentary in Vice, published by Vice, examining the spread of Hindu nationalism, explicitly referenced the violence in Leicester as one example of how followers of Hindu nationalism are inflaming tensions across the world. Littlewood has gone so far as to claim that the turmoil in Leicester was, quote, predominantly Islamist attack on Hindus, not just merely downplaying the presence and role of Hindu nationalist sentiment in the city, but completely denying its existence and instead promoting Islamophobic narratives. Many of the voices in the industry smear individuals who do call attention to Hindu nationalism as either, quote, Islamist if the critical voice is Muslim, or, quote, Islamist sympathizer if the critical voice is non-Muslim. And such allegations are used to silence rightful criticism and put the lives of these individuals in danger. One of the other major sections in our report was looking at actually what occurred in Leicester in 2022. The events had a massive impact on the city and brought forth a number of issues that need to be addressed when it comes to community cohesion. And one of these that we looked at was the role of social media disinformation. During this period, an extensive digital ecosystem encompassing right-wing social media influencers, organizations, and anonymous social media accounts from both the UK and India inflamed tensions in the city. Voices from both the UK and India use their social media platforms to create narratives and make allegations as the events are unfolded. Our analysis of the accounts illustrates how outside voice influences within this ecosystem played a significant role in exacerbating the tensions through the spread of disinformation. For example, Nupur J. Sharma, she's the editor-in-chief of Op India, which is a right-wing website based in India, tweeted, and I'm summarizing here, that she had been told by some Hindu orgs in Leicester that several families, around 200, had been displaced from Leicester and were unwilling to go back because they were scared of violence by, quote, Islamists. Leicestershire police replied to her tweet saying that it was unaware of any sort of displacement of families, which suggests that such claims were fabricated. And at the time of writing the report, the tweet was up. And it had been liked and retweeted almost 12,000 times and 5,000 times respectively, highlighting the spread of such disinformation. Between the 17th and 21st of September, at which the tensions were at their highest, approximately 60,000 tweets used hashtags such as Stop Leicester Islamic Terrorism, hashtag Hindus under attack in Leicester, and so forth. According to Logically, which is a fact-checking organization seeking to tackle mis and disinformation online, 20,000 of those tweets were geotagged, and of that number, 18,000, so 81%, were from Twitter accounts in India, while just 1,200 were from UK accounts. This also corroborated an investigation by the BBC, which found that tweets relating to the disorder in Leicester spiked between the 17th and 21st of September. And that on the 19th of September, there were a total of almost 150,000 such tweets, a large proportion of which were, again, geotagged to India. And many of these accounts had no profile picture and were set up within the previous month, which indicates, quote, inauthentic activity. Meaning that anonymous individuals were using multiple accounts, so bots, to spread disinformation and anti-Muslim sentiment. And we also do highlight in the report misinformation was also circulated on social media by Muslim individuals, which exacerbated the unrest in the city. For example, a Muslim man from Leicester alleged on Facebook that his 15-year-old daughter was the victim of a kidnapping attempt by 3 Hindu men. The following day, Majid Freeman, a local community activist, shared the post on his Twitter page. However, Leicestershire police carried out an investigation and concluded on the 14th that no such incident occurred. And in response, Freeman deleted his original tweet and tweeted regarding the alleged incident that, quote, such lies have consequences and casts doubts on genuine cases. Ultimately, social media disinformation activity as a whole perpetuated tensions in Leicester by proliferating false or otherwise unhelpful narratives. It's evident here that there was a concerted campaign of disinformation from Hindu nationalist online accounts in relation to what happened in Leicester, whereas Muslim activity on social media was more individual based, not nearly as coordinated or widespread.
Thank you, Mobashra. I think we'll move on to Dr. Chris Allen.
Hi, thanks very much. Thanks so much for inviting me to talk at this event tonight. It's probably worth mentioning that this is the first time that I've actually spoke publicly about the events in Leicester since being appointed as the lead of the independent inquiry, independent review, which was set up by the Leicester Mayor Peter Salisbury just over a year ago. And as you may well know, I was appointed as the lead reviewer, and then stepped down from that role 3 days later, which is worth just kind of giving a little bit of context to. So I am someone that, for 2 decades has been undertaking research into topics such as Islamophobia, the problematization of Muslim communities in Britain, looking at the issues around kind of counter-terrorism, counter-extremism, the kind of way in which those policies kind of played out. But also, if you look back into my body of research I've done, having kind of undertaken research around other forms of religiously motivated hate, extremism, and kind of like conflict between different religious groups. So my role is, I've always been an academic. I've not been. I'm not an activist in that respect. So I'm an academic. My research, has always been kind of something which some individuals don't like, or they dislike, or they disagree with. But my research stands as kind of as being robust and rigorous and importantly independent as well. And so, my appointment was on that basis. It was something that was, appointed on the basis of me being an academic, an independent academic, and someone with appropriate kind of experience and expertise within the city of Leicester to be able to do so. But of course, that, this was something which became really kind of a real problem in terms of this, and was something that was particularly, kind of targeted by, those from within the Hindutva movement, or those, who adhere to the ideologies of that. And so what I want to do tonight is I just want to speak about some of the learning that I got from, being appointed for 3 days as the independent reviewer, from the campaign of hate, which was subsequently targeted at me and went on for a good number of months, and indeed continues to. And also for the research that I specifically undertook in preparation for the role, and also that I've undertaken since around this kind of topic. And I guess that for me, I think one of the most important things to kind of highlight is that so much of this actually aligns with the findings from the report from the Bridge Institute and the Community Policy Forum. And one of the things that really stands out for me is the kind of the resonance and the similarities between what we see as Hindu nationalism and its kind of manifestation, particularly in Leicester last year, with the kind of way in which, kind of white nationalism or manifested through the British radical right and the British extreme right wing really has, we've seen over the last kind of 2 decades. And so I want to just kind of talk around a few of those issues really, and kind of highlight some of the similarities and some of the things that we maybe should be concerned about in terms of internationalism in Leicester and also in the UK more generally, but also in terms of the potential for this being something which is particularly pernicious towards Muslim communities across the country. And I think that the first thing really is that, the resonance between what we saw in Leicester last year and what I would describe as, kind of the post-organisational kind of groups and movements from within the British radical right. If you look at something like the English Defence League or the Democratic Football Lads Alliance, this kind of like informal networks, the kind of online mobilisation, the kind of, the kind of direct action, street movement, as opposed kind of electoral politics. We also saw that again last year in Leicester, and probably the best example of this was on the 17th of September, when there was an impromptu gathering of around 200 men who marched through Muslim majority areas of the city, chanting Jai Shri Ram, which translates as Hail Lord Ram, a phrase that has become synonymous with Hindutva violence in India. And as someone that's kind of observed kind of the white nationalist, the British kind of radical right, kind of protests and demonstrations and street movements, in action in the UK over the last 2 years, what you from the witness reports that you saw from kind of what occurred in Leicester, in terms of these kind of 200 men, and what you saw in locations such as Dudley and Luton, from the EDL and Tommy Robinson led kind of protests and demonstrations. There really was something that wasn't very different in that respect. So, there's a real resonance in terms of that. The second really relates to the ideology and the ideology of Islamophobia. If you look at the British radical right over the past kind of 20 years, and you see that ideological turn around the time of 9/11. You see the British National Party, and then you see that lineage through the EDL, Britain First, Democratic Football Lads Alliance, and others, and you can see this ideological lineage where the focus shifts away from kind of traditional nationalism, where it's on kind of like race or kind of anti-Semitism, for example, and you see this move on to kind of Muslims, Muslim communities, the religion of Islam, and in other ways immigration as well, which also ties in with Islam. And one of the things that you saw there was this kind of the way in which the tropes of Islamophobia become used to kind of like to justify the behaviours, to justify the actions, and also to kind of like victimize Muslim communities. And this is what we saw in Leicester. And one of the things that also, this kind of stuff is very clever in doing is that by using Islamophobia, because it becomes so normalized and accepted, it actually helps to shift the narrative away from, say, the kind of the actual threat that was posed by the Hindutva movement and those who kind of like, the ethno-nationalist ideology that those who adhere to it kind of subscribe to. And this was obvious, this was obvious from the outset. And I wrote in a piece I wrote for The Conversation, just over a year ago. I said that it was the immediate response by many was to point the finger of blame for the disturbances on Islamist extremism. But as I went on, I said there's despite there being no evidence to support such an assumption, my research shows that a key trope of Islamophobia is the conflation of all things Islam with extremism. The mere involvement of Muslims will be evidence enough for some to jump to such a conclusion, and we saw that in the introduction from Mobashra. This idea that actually the immediate thing was to say, well, it's Islamist extremists, and there were Muslims who behaved in extreme activities, but actually as a kind of was this a response that was from a kind of organized Islamist extremist movement or group or organization? Well, no. And of course, that this really did actually kind of serve to deflect attention. It served as a smokescreen behind which this kind of the Hindutva ideologies were able to kind of like manifest and act and kind of, and also kind of inform the kind of response. And I guess that this was particularly evident as someone as an individual. The tropes of Islamophobia really were used as part of the hate campaign that was directed towards me. So I was an entryist. I was a fifth columnist. I was trying to take over Leicester City Council from the inside. I was an Islamist extremist sympathiser. For others, I was just an Islamist extremist. It was alleged that I had. I'd been funded by Jamaat-e-Islami. I'd been funded by the Muslim Brotherhood. Some claim that I had, threatened and bullied, Peter Salisbury into appointing me. I was a 9/11 denier. I was a conspiracy theorist, and so on. And all of the things that were said about me were actually the tropes of Islamophobia that have been said about Muslims and Muslim communities and the religion of Islam for the last, kind of two decades. And so, and I think that this is really important to kind of put this, kind of there, because, for some, this was evident, the allegations were evidence enough for some to jump to conclusion. And I think that the final point, the final similarity really is that what we see with really the extreme right wing and, what demarcates the radical right from the extreme right wing is the propensity and willingness to use violence as a means to achieve the goals or to achieve the outcomes, the ideological outcomes. And I think that this is one of the things we've seen this within the Hindutva movement in India is the propensity and willingness to actually deploy violence, to kind of achieve its goals. And I think that we shouldn't be surprised really when those who adhere to the same or affiliated to the same ideologies actually are willing to, or at least have the propensity to use violence here in the UK as well. And I think that again, both in terms of the threats, the death threats that were directed to me, but also the actual real threats of violence that people on the street, people within Muslim communities across the city actually felt and experienced that, was something that becomes very real and very tangible and something that is extremely worrying. And I think that just to kind of, to wrap up, and I've spoken too long already, I think that one of the things that we have to be aware of is that there is a potential, there's a potential for, a very worrying alliance between those from within the Hindutva movement in the UK and those within the British radical right in particular. And I think that on the basis of the enemy and my enemy is my friend, I think that we need to be very concerned about this. And so not only do we have the threats of, kind of nationalism from the kind of the British radical right, but also the Hindutva movement. But I think that particularly for Muslim communities, especially the threat from both of those finding kind of alliances and allegiances between them, I think becomes very worrying indeed. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Chris, for that. And I think now we'll go to Dr. Fatima Rajina for her introduction.
So first of all, thank you for having me. Good evening and assalamu alaikum, everyone. Firstly, thank you to the organisers for putting this event together and for having me on this important panel to discuss an issue that is, very quietly changing the political relations and political landscape between different communities in the UK. And it's also exerting influence on international relations between the UK and India in particular. But before I proceed with some of my thoughts after reading the report, I do want to quickly introduce myself. So my name is Fatima Rajina. I'm a Senior Legacy and Action Research Fellow based at the Stephen Lawrence Research Centre at the Montfort University, which is in Leicester. I've been working in Leicester for 4 years now, so I'm quite familiar with the city's landscape and different communities. And following the events last year, I did write a piece for New Lines magazine outlining how various aspects of the analysis that was coming out following the event were missing certain elements and not understanding this particular, ideology and how that was shaping a lot of the ways these tensions have been rising in the past few years. So I appreciate the report recognizing these historical links and moments that shape and help in understanding and analyzing last year's events. But there are particular aspects of the report I want to highlight, but also I want to highlight other elements that may not be, I would argue, aren't so visible in public yet. So I'd say one of the things I appreciated about the report stance around the unrest from last year in Leicester was that, as I've mentioned, that Hindutva and its particular political ways of playing out in India and with its specific targeting of Muslims, Dalits, and Christians is important. But I think it's important to also consider its very tentacles and how it has traveled globally. I think this has been very, very well documented by the likes of Amrit Wilson from South Asia Solidarity Group, where she wrote a piece titled From Nagpur to Nairobi to New Delhi, Tracing Global Hindutva. The report thus stresses the importance of paying attention to Hindutva here in the UK to understand how it has historically established itself, but also to factor in its contemporary marks by multiple organizations and groups. The other element that Mobashra has already highlighted, but I would like to, I'm keen to emphasize, is to keep in mind here that we need to acquaint ourselves with the very specific distinction between what we mean by Hindutva political ideology and Hinduism. Hindutva, as explained in the report, is an ethno-nationalist movement that seeks to establish Hindu hegemony in India and should not be confused with Hinduism, which is a religion of more than 1 billion people with its own sets of rituals, practices, and cultural expressions. One facet of the report that particularly stood out for me was the part about how in India there was a specific targeting of Indian Muslims, whereby they are rendered second-class citizens and taking out aspects of history to do with Muslims in India from its curriculum and much more. While I argue that this is also being done subtly here in the UK through various organizations, although this is being done by other means. So I'll give an example. An organization not named in the current report we're discussing, produced by the Bridge Initiative and Community Policy Forum, but I want to highlight because it will help us understand the ways in which Hindutva politics is spreading by paying attention to the growth of an institute called the 1928 Institute. I want to direct you to one of the reports to highlight the nefarious ways Hindutva is enabled in the corridors of power. The 1928 Institute published a report in May of 2021 titled Identity, Political Representation and Policy Priorities, the British Indian Experience. Now, in this report produced by the Institute, I want to point out that Muslims are only mentioned once in the entire 38-page document, thus erasing the very presence of Indian Muslims here in Britain, where Indian Muslims number at 245,681 in England alone, and this does not include any of the Welsh data from the 2021 census. And the 1928 Institute conflates Indian identity with Hinduphobia, and that this form of prejudice needs to be taken as seriously as that of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And with this particular conflation, they make the grand claim that 80% of those who responded had experienced prejudice as a result of their Indian identity. And within this, the most commonly reported type of prejudice is Hinduphobia. Now, this has been dissected, dismantled, and challenged by Amrit Wilson. And Amrit Wilson actually spoke to someone from the Institute regarding this particular statistic, which she reports in her piece titled The New Strategies of Hindu Supremacists in Britain, where the spokesperson actually admitted that the data sample may have been skewed since Hinduphobia was only mentioned by a comparatively small number of people, and that too in optional comments. Now, before I proceed to this particular data that was used by the 1928 Institute, I want to emphasize that the Indian or the British Indian in a lot of their work and reports is produced solely in relation to those of dharmic faith. So those who are Jain, Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, Hindu, Buddhist, and Sikh, and completely disregards the presence of Muslims and the fact that the Indian can constitute, or the British Indian can constitute being Muslim. But to go back to this data that I just mentioned, this data may appear innocuous, but this was then picked up and heralded as solid data to prove that Hinduphobia is not taken seriously. Now, this particular research was then used by Navendu Mishra, a member of the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs, who tabled an early day motion about Hinduphobia and through this acquired 45 MP signatures. Now, the latest development in this saga regarding Hinduphobia has now meant that beginning of this very month, the British Hindu Labour Assembly member, Krupesh Hirani's motion on Hinduphobia was passed unanimously at the London Assembly. Now, this particular discussion at the London Assembly is available on Insight UK website, one of the organisations named in the report, co-authored by Community Policy Forum and the Bridge Initiative, as one of the key organisers of Hindutva-related activities here in the UK. Now, we can also take a look at the work of Dr. Edward Anderson, based at Northumbria University, and how we need to reflect, and I quote, on the diversity of contemporary Hindutva, which appears simultaneously brazen but concealed, nebulous and mainstreamed, militant yet normalized. The push for Hindutva ideology's presence in British politics is being done in the most subtle of ways through respectability politics, through the indulgence of being a part of the good minority, thus adopting the model minority framing from the United States. Now, the 1928 Institute also organized a recent Diwali party in Parliament, and David Lammy was in attendance. And just to remind you, David Lammy, a few weeks before that, refused to call what Israel is doing in Gaza a war crime, as he viewed it as inappropriate to do so as a future foreign secretary. I'm specifically pointing out David Lammy's political position on what is happening in Palestine right now as it relates to our very conversation we're having here today. Today's report considers, by building on the work of the journalist Azad Isa, that we have to pay very careful attention to the overlaps between Hindutva ideology and Zionism, and particularly drawing our attention to the Zionist settler colonial ideas around settlement, which is something the BJP are looking to mirror in the pursuit of taking over Jammu and Kashmir, which is a political issue that has been used here in Leicester to cause division between Hindus and Muslims, and by portraying the Labour Party as anti-Hindu and anti-India under Jeremy Corbyn. Another element of today's report we should pay attention to is how, following the unrest in Leicester, much of the analysis relied on age-old tropes around it being a supposedly Pakistan versus India tensions that are playing out on the streets of Leicester. Now, even through this particular framing, what we're seeing is that there is still a refusal to accept the presence of Indian Muslims in Leicester, who number at 40,119, made up from the 34.3% of Leicester's British Indian community. Now, just to give you a bit of a contrast, Pakistani Muslims in Leicester only make up just under 12,000 and Bangladeshi Muslims just under 7,000. And just to remind you again, Indian Muslims in Leicester make up or over 40,000 of the Muslim community in Leicester. However, relying on this age-old trope of Indians versus Pakistanis or Indian versus Pakistan also obfuscates the presence of Hindutva through its multiple organizations, including, but not limited to, the National Council of Hindu Temples, Vishwa Hindu Parishad, Insight UK, the 1928 Institute, and many others. So I guess to conclude here, I want to stress that when British Indians of whichever religious background are discriminated against, and have been up until 9/11, was usually because of their racial positioning as Asian. For those of us familiar with the racial landscape here in Britain, recognize that, for example, historically, what was known as Paki bashing, although it still exists and has its many iterations, Paki bashing was targeted and aimed at anyone that was presumed to be South Asian, and many deaths have occurred in the last 60, 70 years through Paki bashing that has been on the bodies of Indians, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, all alike. Now, this landscape, of course, as I just mentioned, changed following 9/11, where the Muslim was being consumed via the South Asian, which means that any South Asian was ascribed being Muslim even when they weren't. So in that sense, the focus on Hinduphobia as real is simply untrue, as there is no structural or historical basis for such a phobia. Invoking it operates as a way to distract many of us from discussing the presence and rise of Hindutva politics here in the UK and its particular influences that are coming from India, but also from Canada and the US. And if we want to understand Leicester better, if we want to understand what unfolded last year in Leicester, then Hindutva is central to it all, and we have to ensure that we push back in making sure that we do not accept narratives deflecting, and one of the strategies here is to claim that Hinduphobia is a thing when it isn't. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. We're now going to move on to a Q&A session, which will be open to all of the panelists. And the first thing I sort of want to ask you about is this sort of concept of silencing. We know that in India, those who have been vocal in their opposition to the BJP government, like, say, for instance, Arundhati Roy and various other social activists, they've been subject to clear attempts at silencing them. So we know that there's been legal action taken against Arundhati Roy just because of a speech that she did in, I think, 2010, talking about the issue of Kashmir. You've all kind of alluded to, and Chris spoke in detail actually, to the attempts at trying to sort of stop the three of you, in fact, from speaking out on this issue. To what extent do you think this attempt has been successful or will be successful in terms of taking the spotlight off the dangers of extremism, Hindutva extremism? I'll go to Chris first.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I mean, I think that I would say that the attempts to silence worked. I mean, you know, if you look back at the number of, you know, I mean, when you know, yes, there's apparently a new review or an inquiry which is underway, but has it actually kind of moved forward? No. So, you know, it was a very clever technique to kind of undermine me and my reputation and my kind of ability and capability to be able to lead the review. It served to silence me. It served to silence the review. So it stopped the review immediately. I mean, there was no way that there was any possibility for, you know, the city council to actually appoint anybody afterwards that was ever going to meet everybody's kind of everybody would be happy with. And really, I mean, you know, we really are no further forward than what we would have been if we were able to turn the clock back a year. So it was completely, you know, I mean, it was completely successful. You know, the whole campaign was completely successful, and you know, it was very successful as well in you know, in silencing me as well. You know, I wasn't able to, you know, the reason why I stepped down, and which I, you know, was said at the time, was that I wasn't able to do something that would hold up as an academic piece of research, you know, to academic standards to be able to do it. And so, you know, if I'd have carried on where a whole constituency kind of boycotted and said they were going to boycott it, there was no way you could actually ever, you know, kind of produce anything that was going to be kind of tangible or, you know, kind of like meaningful in any way. So yeah, so I think it worked. I mean, I think it was a very successful campaign to silence me, to silence the review, and to silence really any kind of further debate around the topic within the city of Leicester.
Thanks for that, Chris. That's actually really worrying. And this is the first time we've actually heard from your perspective what actually happened during that period. And it is of concern. And we know that you're not the only person that has been subjected to some of this sort of barrage. Fatima, I'll come to you. How do we fight against this? How do we ensure that silencing doesn't work?
I mean, firstly, I think it's important that we understand the history of the development of Hindutva, and recognizing that and how it emerged, to understand how it's playing out in the British context, while also paying attention to how it's playing out in other parts of sort of North American societies. And I think one of the things that is important, you know, someone who has been speaking about this actually for a very long time is Amrit Wilson, from South Asia Solidarity Group. You know, she's written about it extensively. She's connected, for example, within the Midlands context, of how the presence of and the arrival of East African Asians actually brought along from there a lot of the presence of HSS officers and various other branches of Hindutva, you know, political ideology in Leicester, and how that and how those elements play out. You know, because they have various wings for women, for children, for elders. So I think, you know, I think the starting point is to be familiar with this landscape, how it plays out, its multiple tentacles. But also, you know, going back to the silencing question, you know, sometimes you just have to continue to push back, whether it's writing, you know, your books, writing your articles, turning up to these events, because as you all know, you know, there were various complaints submitted against me at my institution, but you just sort of show up and have these conversations, because if we're not having these conversations, then it will be dominated by the other side, which is here to make lots of grand claims which have been completely debunked. And this report that we're discussing today is one of them that has debunked various moments that were being claimed as, you know, facts. So I think it's important to keep the conversation going in order to be able to dismantle all of these facts and And also, I mean, coming back to Leicester specifically, for Leicester, it's added a lot of tensions. Sometimes you can't go to local sort of Asian high streets without really feeling it. So I think, if we don't discuss it, those tensions are going to bubble away. And when, it reaches its tipping point, we're going to then, have another conversation about how did this happen. But in order to avoid the whole how did this happen, we need to really continue the conversation. And I don't mean it in the sort of mundane way of constantly organizing events, but genuinely being aware through research, through knowledge production, through disseminating it on our campuses, through engaging local communities. But I think these conversations have to involve and have to be done honestly, because sometimes I found sometimes these conversations because again it goes back to people's lack of familiarity with the topic and knowledge that's not there. So I think yeah, that would be my response to your question.
Thank you for that. I think what was shocking, especially from the perspective of Leicester residents, is to what extent they were so successful in terms of sort of sowing division in a city that had historically never shown that type of division, certainly not between communities before. And what's really clear is that it is a dangerous and pervasive sort of force in terms of trying to, being successful in dividing us in that way. Mobashra, I'm going to just put that question to you. At any point, did you feel that pressure was going to avert your participation in an event like this, or did you feel threatened in any way in any of this?
I think anyone who talks about this topic and who talks about Hindu nationalism has faced some sort of pressure or some sort of harassment campaign, whether it be publishing an article or writing a book or even taking part in a panel. That seems to be a common sort of response, especially online on social media. And I'm really glad you brought up this topic of, feeling targeted. I want to bring it back to India, where we're seeing a massive rise in Hindu nationalism under Modi. Journalists are being targeted, activists are being targeted, human rights organizations are being targeted, and the government's using actual legislation. So UAPA, it's a form of legislation framing basically speech and certain things as framing it as terrorism, as signs of terrorism. So journalists have been imprisoned without charge under this sort of legislation, and activists. And a lot of this happened actually after the 2020 the Delhi pogroms that happened. And then there were a huge activist movement following the anti-CAA protests with a lot of young people, a lot of students on university campuses in India, and they were arrested under this legislation as well. And then in terms of what I've seen in the UK and in the US, it's been a lot of academics who are being targeted with this online harassment, who talk about this issue and who are raising awareness about this issue. And it's sort of this silencing and censoring in an effort to kind of get people to not talk about this issue, even though it is a major issue that isn't restricted to India. We're seeing it play out in different parts of the world. For example, in the US, last year during the Indian Independence Day parade in Edison, New Jersey, there was a prop used in the parade of a bulldozer and with a picture of the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh. And the bulldozer, for those of you who don't know, has kind of become a symbol of muscular Hindu nationalism in India. It's been used by the Modi government to intimidate and to target Muslims' homes and businesses, especially individuals who have been vocal against the government, but also just as collective punishment. And it's been used to raise their homes and businesses. And so the fact that a bulldozer was shown at an Indian Independence Day parade, where Indian Muslims are also taking part in, was really shocking. Thankfully there was a huge response to that, and the mayor condemned it as well. But it's not just relegated to India. And I think another aspect of this is how social media platforms are being used to target and intimidate and harass and silence individuals. Just as, like I said in my presentation, if you just look at our promotion for this event on social media, you will see the dozens and dozens of comments that we got of just really, really nasty and Islamophobic and racist things. And I think for me, I've always, this is what I research, and this is an important topic, and it impacts the lives of millions, if not billions, of people around the world. And I think any sort of movement that renders an individual a second-class citizen or impacts their human rights is something that we should talk about, because if it's not directly impacting us, it will directly impact us at one point or another. But yeah, that's how I would feel about that.
Thanks very much, Mobashra. I think one of the things that shocked a lot of residents in Leicester, or surprised a lot of residents in Leicester, was the extent to which people who'd never set foot in the city were suddenly experts on what happened, what played out in those few weeks. To what extent do you think outside sort of influences sort of shaped the way the narrative was seen? And by outside influences, I also talk about social media, which is a big part of this report. Mobashra, I'll come to you on that one.
Yeah, I think they played a major role in kind of exacerbating the tension. The tensions were there, but it kind of was really inflamed by outside voices. And a lot of those outside voices came from India and people with big, big platforms. Poor Sharma, who we mentioned in the report, she has hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter. India is a right-wing media source that has consistently published Islamophobic content, is very much so a mouthpiece of the government, of the BJP government. And so these sorts of voices played a very, very massive role. And I think it's something that needs to really be tackled in terms of how do we tackle disinformation on social media, because it clearly had very, very harmful consequences in Leicester and could be used again in other situations.
Thanks, Mobashra. I'll come to you, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, what was really interesting for me, and I agree with Mobashra, the role of social media was really significant. I mean, you just saw the numbers of kind of tweets. These topics were trending, on Twitter. They were constantly there. I mean, in terms of the stuff that was directed towards me, I would say there was more coming from India than there was actually from the UK. I mean, you have to, social media is social media, so you can draw conclusions from that, but most of the abuse that I was receiving was, from kind of accounts that had Indian flags, in their kind of profile, had, very specific imagery around, kind of, certain religious, kind of like iconography and so on. I mean, just to give you an example, I was receiving over 1,000 interactions every day on Twitter. At the height of it, I received over 300 emails to my work email. Colleagues were receiving emails, kind of saying that there would be a physical response. I mean, that's the actual phrase, a physical response towards me, and that colleagues should warn me. My family was being attacked on social media, even to the extent where my daughter was too scared to tag my grandsons in photos with me, because this was so great. But as I say, this was outside noise, and what was interesting, one of the things that I found really staggering was the extent to which I was featured on Indian news, and I would have people constantly sending me clips where my face was on Indian news, and the phrase "Hindu hater," was something that was readily associated with that, and again, so that outside noise, that the kind of transnational nature of this is something that is really, we can't underestimate, because this was this was very much about Leicester for me, but it was also something which was national, and then it went transnational as well. And, you know, that's something that is really, really important. We need to bear in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it shocked a lot of the residents in Leicester as well, to what extent it became such a global thing. Fatima, do you have any thoughts to add on this?
I mean, social media definitely, you know, as Chris and Mobashra have said, exacerbated the situation. But even after I wrote my piece, which was a generic sort of historical piece and considering sort of Leicester's landscape, my God, I was sort of bombarded with all sorts of sort of gendered Islamophobia, you know, being a Muslim woman. One of the terms that I used against Muslim women in particular in India is the term mulli, coming from mullah, but the feminine form mulli. Like I was called it. Every other tweet, I was called that. I was called lots of other things, and then it just also became brought in sort of weird geopolitics where it was trying to target also me as a Bengali Muslim, and then trying to figure that out. And how to position the Bengali Muslim, because it's not so black and white, it seems, with the way they target Bengali Muslims. So yeah, it was all very very strange, but also just absolutely unhinged. Unhinged is the only word I can think of in the way they targeted me. But I also did see some of the stuff, Chris, that was sort of aimed at you, and it was just ruthless. And again, actually, a lot of the stuff actually, Chris, that also were written under my piece and just sort of sent to me via DMs as well, were from India. So a lot of it wasn't from the UK. So there's something to be said about how, you know, social media's landscape is also transnational, and how that then shapes conversations, and how then, you know, you have a whole global conversation about this, because I know that this conversation was happening in America as well. From a lot of the Asians that I know in America, they were sort of talking about it, what is happening, you know, trying to figure out where Leicester is, you know. So it just became like a whole conversation in different parts of the globe, and it was because of social media. So yeah, so social media is definitely playing a key role in all of this.
Thank you, Fatima. So next year we'll see elections both in India and in the United Kingdom. And one of the things that we saw, certainly with the local elections just gone, is that elections become an opportunity to sort of open up a lot of these wounds. And we've seen some political capitalization on the part of some sort of political actors, shall we say, in terms of trying to use these divides that have been opened up since the riots last year in order to maximize their electoral success. What extent do you think this is going to play into the elections, certainly for those in Leicester next year, but also to what extent will the Indian elections sort of impact our politics going forward? I'll go to Fatima first.
I mean, a lot of, you know, a lot of our local politics is connected to global politics from, you know, various parts of the globe. And I think, you know, India is no exception here, particularly its rise as a global power now. So I think it would be very naive to think that there isn't, because we saw how, for example, when Jeremy Corbyn was leading Labour, and there was a sort of discussion about Kashmir, because it was under his leadership that the article was revoked, and then there was a whole campaign, I know, in Leicester that, you know, don't vote for Labour, that Labour candidates, don't vote for, you know, the Labour MP candidate, because, you know, if you do, then you're voting for Muslims, and you're voting in favour of Muslims. So, you know, it played out then, and that was then used in other parts of the UK, like Harrow and Brent. We saw that play out as well. But even in, you know, I think we've got to remember how that politics plays out in other contexts. So if you remember the London mayoral election between Sadiq Khan and Zach Goldsmith relied on a lot of quotes around, you know, and used sort of dog whistle politics around Sadiq Khan being Muslim and Pakistani Muslim at that, and trying to reassure a predominantly Indian Hindu diaspora community of sort of to not trust him. So again, this constant reliance, whether it's by South Asian politicians here in Britain or other non-South Asian politicians who rely on particular geopolitical quotes that they become suddenly familiar with overnight, but don't actually understand what any of it means, but utilize that to cause further division and sow further division. So I think it would be inevitable that we're going to see a presence of that. We've seen it up until now. I don't think it will be any different in the upcoming elections, whether it's in Leicester or elsewhere. And I think, you know, the relations that are increasing between India and UK is also something we've got to pay attention to, because the visit to India was just fairly recently by Rishi Sunak. So I think it's something we'll have to pay attention to. But if we go by anything from the recent few elections, whether in Leicester, you know, the local elections or what happened in 2019, you know, I think it would be very naive to assume it won't reappear in next year's election.
Thanks, Fatima. Mobashra, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just gonna, I agree with what Fatima is saying as well. I think next year is also the US election. So there's three major elections happening next year and gonna have a massive global consequence because of it. And if you noticed, you know, since for the past almost a decade, we've seen a global rightward shift in our politics, and where it's almost as if far right kind of platforms have become normalized and mainstreamed through right wing parties. And I think divisive politics has become the norm, and it's been something that a lot of parties are now using, where it's less about actual policies and more about divisive tactics and discriminatory rhetoric and scapegoating the community. And often what we've seen in a lot of these elections in the past, and it's been the Muslim communities that have been scapegoated. So under Modi, it's been Indian Muslims. Under the UK, it's been British Muslims. In the US, it's been American Muslims. So Islamophobia plays a massive role. In studies that have been done in the US, we've seen a massive uptick in Islamophobia during election years. It is a very useful strategy. So yeah, I think it will play a role, and I think it's going to be a very monumental year. And yeah, it's a lot happening next year.
Yeah, and I think we'll see Islamophobia being adopted as a strategy in the UK probably as well, and in India, and of course. Quite depressing facts, really. Chris, did you want to add anything to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on the situation in India, but I can definitely talk about the situation in the UK. And I think that, I mean, one of the things that was interesting was that, you know, when this first started last year, Rishi Sunak had been kind of overlooked in preference of Liz Truss to become the Prime Minister. And at that time, included in some of the abuse that was coming my way was that, well, the UK, you know, hates Hindus. You know, look at the way they've overlooked, you know, Rishi Sunak. And as soon as I think it was the 25th of October or something around that Rishi Sunak became like Prime Minister, then that narrative then obviously changed. And it, you know, so it's there. So I think that you know, one of the things is that, you know, what you can see is that religion and the perception of religion, you know, kind of, you know, it can be used to shape narratives from both ways. And we, you know, and I saw that straight away, you know, one minute the UK is anti-Muslim, the next minute it's like, oh no, yeah, now it's different, you know, so very, you know, so things can change literally overnight. I think one of the things that hasn't changed and probably, you know, has become more embedded in the last 2 decades is the fact that Islamophobia is just completely unquestioned now within the political spaces, you know, in the UK. And this is something, you know, I mean, we've seen David Cameron return to, you know, the kind of the kind of front bench of politics again. And this is a man that, don't forget, in 2013, 2014, told British Muslims to be more British. I mean, you know, what that means, I have no idea. As a British person, I have no idea what that means. I don't know how I can be more British. I don't know how Muslims can be more British, you know. But this is the stuff that's kind of been there. You know, we have the old muscular liberalism thing from David Cameron. You know, we've seen, you know, with, you know, the kind of present Prime Minister, you know, this idea around, you know, kind of the need to reshape, prevent, you know, back onto, you know, the threat of Islamist extremism when we see the threat from the extreme right wing, you know, increasing. And we see, you know, new forms of extremism, you know, posing new threats to us, you know, like, and, you know, kind of, you know, different communities in society more generally. So, and I think that that's the thing for me is that, you know, where we have to be so conscious and so aware is the fact that Islamophobia, you know, we know and we can see over the last 2 decades has not only seeped in, but it's flooded into the political mainstream. And it's, you can say that someone's an Islamist extremist and it's just unquestioned, it's so normalized that actually that's what it is. And so Muslims will continue, while this is the way it is, Muslims will continue to be the scapegoats for so much within the political spaces. And so the potential for it being used again in the same way next year is almost an absolute certainty, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're right on that, Chris. I think Islamophobia has become one of these types of sort of bigotry that's almost like a learned opinion. It's not necessarily recognized as a form of bigotry almost anymore. I mean, I know we're going over 7 o'clock now, so I'm just going to finish off with one question. We've talked about some of the dangers that many of you have encountered just talking about this issue. But what are the dangers of not talking about this issue? What are the dangers of not speaking out about sort of the dangers of Hindutva and how it's playing out in India and in the UK? I'll come to Mobashra first.
I mean, the biggest danger is normalizing this sort of hate if we don't speak out about it, and impacting the lives of millions, if not billions of people. I think any sort of movement and any sort of ideology that perpetuates the hate and dehumanization of others is something that needs to be talked about and needs to be addressed. Whereas if, no one is talking about it, then the governments and those in power have unfettered access to continue discriminating against individuals. I think it's important to talk about it because it impacts the lives of so many people, and there's real harms and real consequences at stake.
Chris?
Yeah, I mean, we've said previously that we even for this event, all of us have been targeted in one way or another, or kind of pressured not to actually speak up. But I think the problem is if you don't speak up, then it allows to fester and grow. And I think that when any form of extremism, when any form of kind of nationalism, when any form of kind of racism, and I use that in its kind of racism not just being based on race, but as a discriminatory phenomena. I think that one of the things that we have to do is we just have to keep talking about it. And we have to keep raise awareness. We have to kind of keep it in the consciousness. We have to kind of keep stressing this, because it's as an academic and as academics, one of the things is sometimes we're very much at arm's length and we're detached from this. And actually, when someone like myself does research, I don't necessarily experience what the people who are being targeted by these kind of ideologies and by these extremist movements kind of like actually experience. And so, it can become something which becomes very, kind of like, doesn't not real or kind of, meaningful. And I think that if we are silent, if we don't talk about it, then it's the victims that not only experience this, but also will continue to suffer in silence and continue to suffer in a worse way. And so, so we have to keep talking about this stuff, and we have to keep our voices.
Thanks, Chris. Fatima?
I mean, I don't feel like I can really add anything else, but I think the thing that I do want to point out is to recognize how a particular language has been used by those who advocate for Hindutva politics. You have this sort of liberation language that's used in a lot of the work. So the 1928 Institute, the report I cited, there's a sort of discussion around decolonizing and our indigenous philosophy, our indigenous ways. And I just think about what those terms even mean and how with those terms, because obviously within sort of anti-racism circles you have a lot of conversations about different communities and the impact. And what worries me is that when that language is used and then under the sort of guise of multiculturalism, and then when you're not familiar, when you're not speaking about it, people will then see that as an extension of simply anti-racism, when actually it isn't. It's a much bigger problem here. So I think as soon as we can the earlier you diagnose this problem and the earlier you lead on these conversations and have these conversations, the quicker it is to notice it and not let it sort of use this particular language, anti-racist language liberation framework, as a way to sort of infiltrate spaces and be in the corridors of power as if it's there to discuss a a real issue, for example, like Hinduphobia, that isn't there. So I think, yeah, the conversation, if you remain silent, it means those things will continue. And when we, have remained silent, things have passed, like at the beginning of November, because everyone has been talking and preoccupied with focusing on Palestine. You had London Assembly passing Hinduphobia unanimously, and that's really, really worrying, because what is it? What is its definition? And where is this data coming from? And who are the people that are being interviewed? So there's a whole question around methodology, speaking as an academic, but also considering what this means. And if we don't immediately diagnose the, ways this is being framed, then it will just reach, and seep into other areas here in Britain. And then by then it will simply be too late to be able to call it out for what it is. And the other thing I did want to mention that I didn't get a chance to actually reflect on when I was speaking was, in one section of my talk, I did talk about how Hindutva incorporates the idea of the dharmic faith that includes, for example, the Sikh community. And actually, there's been a lot of tension that's been building up, and the targeting of the Sikh community in particular ways. So I don't want sort of people leaving this talk and thinking that actually it's been easy for the Sikh community when it hasn't. And again, we can look at, examples across the US, Canada, and in the British context as well. And this is why I'm just a little bit reluctant to call it extremism as well, because of the way extremism has been instrumentalized in policy, in the way it has discussed the Muslim community. And it has been coded to the Muslim body that to disentangle that will take a good few decades. So I'm personally not a fan of calling it extremism, but rather a Hindu political ideal, Hindutva political nationalist, ethno-nationalist ideology that is present, and to then speak of it in those terms. So yeah, just a few clarifications I wanted to make with some of the points that I had raised earlier.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate that, Fatima. I think we did encounter some sort of conversations in terms of whether this was a relevant thing to talk about right now, especially with everything that's going on in Israel and Palestine. But I think because it's Islamophobia Awareness Month, it was really important to us at the Bridge Initiative and at Community Policy Forum to ensure that the stories of all Muslims, including Muslims in India, Muslims in Leicester, are also addressed. And so I'm glad that we've been able to do that. And the report that the Bridge Initiative and Community Policy Forum have jointly written will be launched this week. So later on this week, it should be disseminated. And aside from that, I just want to say thank you to Mobashra and to Chris and to Fatima for joining us today, for spending an hour of your evening talking with the rest of us about this really, really important issue. And thank you to everybody that's joined us from the US and in the UK and wherever you are to sort of listen to our esteemed colleagues here talk about this important issue. And with that, I will say good evening and good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.